could be bell-shaped and would go through this whole area using the reactivated infrastructure. The plan was for a university of about 20,000 students built on a network of rail and motorways where different stations would become places of knowledge production, and where permanent places could move. Prizes was the idea of a classroom on the move, where you would have all sorts of housing for professors, researchers and students, crates, sprawls, capsules, and when the existing infrastructure would not be enough, there would also be inflatables designed by Price and which could easily be swiftly added. The pottery think belt at the Fun Palace remain unrealized, but can be revisited now without the nostalgia of being projects from the past. It can be seen as instruction modes or recipes or triggers for artists and architects to engage with the public space and reclaim public space in a new and critical way. Indeed, a model worth mentioning and similar kind of in its flexibility to the Fun Palace and the pottery think belt was developed later in the 60s in France. It is the Maison de la Culture de Grenoble, which was actually imagined by a student of Le Corbusier, André Wojensky, who is now in his late 80s and whom I've also interviewed as part of this sort of infinite conversations, and which actually was the idea of a kind of a permanent laboratory, a structure which has been absolutely crucial for a whole generation of artists, such as Dominique Gonzalez-Foerster or Philippe Pareno, who actually are thinking about the ways to reflect of the space of display. So to sort of, you know, if you're interested in more in knowing about these sort of projects of Price, they were all gathered in this book, which is a book actually designed by Cedric Price shortly before his death last year, which I edited, which is called Recipe. So it's R-E-CP, so it's like revisiting Cedric Price. At the same time, it's like a book of recipes, of kitchen recipes. And again, the notion of time, it has an expiry date. So it, you know, one has to kind of hurry up because it can only be sold until January 2006, because it was the last will of the author that afterwards, like, you know, it can no longer be sold. One has to stick to that kind of plan. And working on this sort of time notion in relation to biennales, I want to show you a very recent project. So maybe if you could have the slides, that would be great.
Are you cool?
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic.
So actually, we were invited together with André Sala to curate a section of the Tirana Biennale last year. So it's another one of these biennales which are prepared like, you know, in a rush. And the problem is also that there is this increasing, you know, element of event culture, which means that you have an event like a big biennale, the whole budget is used for that event, and afterwards there is a big empty hole in the budget and there are no more exhibitions for 2 years. You know, it's again a desert. So it's absolutely counterproductive very often for the local situation. So we, again, in this idea of sustainability, we thought that it could be much more interesting to actually look at what is locally really happening. And one of the most interesting things is that the mayor of Tirana is an artist, Edi Rama. He decided to inject hope into Tirana, which is a city which cannot afford to do big new buildings. So he decided to inject a color plan. So to basically color buildings. And he did it himself, so, you know, during night shifts he drew all the buildings. And suddenly you had streets, it's a bit like an utopia from the 20s in Bruno Taut, no? So suddenly whole streets were full of color, and it's all in conversation with the dialogue. So, you know, suddenly he told us that the grandmother didn't like her balcony in black, so, you know, they repainted it in her favorite color. So it's very much about participation. So we proposed for this biennale that actually artists would be invited to paint the house, so that, you know, it would something which would stay, and which would also, you know, go on for 2 years, so that every month or 2 months another artist is invited to paint the facade of a house in Tirana. It's the project really, really difficult to do from the point of view of the bureaucracy in a city like Paris or London or Berlin. It would like take probably a year or 2 to even get the permission, and even then would be difficult. Whilst it went in 2 weeks, so the artists developed the project, and 2 weeks later, you know, the houses were painted. So here you see Dominique Gonzalez-Foerster. Yeah, Olafur Eliasson, whom we are going to meet in Basel the day after tomorrow. So he developed a sort of a, you know, a house between 2D and 3D. or Liam Gillick, with a kind of a color chart. And there is also, now there is an accelerated Märzbau of Rike Tiramanija. So it's a kind of a homage to Schwitters. There will be a house by Hans-Peter Feldmann. So it's like, an ongoing kind of thing which happens in time. So that's for the moment the images. We can again switch the projector off, please. So these houses obviously are there, permanent. So actually, out of this discussion with Tirana, the mayor of Tirana, the idea was to invite artists to color the facade. And it was with Henri basically also the idea to somehow complexify the mayor's program. So when we decided to invite an international group of artists and develop color schemes for buildings in Tirana, it was very different from what the mayor had decided, because he wanted actually to decide on all the schemes himself, whilst actually suddenly, with these sort of artists, it became like a group show. He had this idea that whole streets would become like a group exhibition. So the buildings would stay, but there will also obviously be an increasing involvement of the artists in Tirana. They will visit Tirana, and as my co-curator Henri Sala, the artist, points out, there will be a different kind of layer of input onto the city. And this project, similar to the previous project I was mentioning, the Weissenhofsiedlung, this project has as well a historical precedent in Bruno Taut's project for the coloring of the city of Magdeburg in Germany. Magdeburg was transformed in the beginning of the 1920s through his color project, which served as a kind of trigger for other more vast changes. In fact, the beginnings of the project by Edi Rama and by Bruno Taut are quite similar. For Taut, there wasn't much money to work with, and in order to establish a strategy for painting the houses and public buildings of the town, Taut needed help from the city, but also he needed help from artists such as Karl Völker and Karl Kreil, actually both very important painters at the time, who got involved in the color schemes. So even if Edi Rama did not look to Taut's project at the beginning, the existence of this historical precedent suggests that there are past strategies in various fields that may be relevant and can provoke change and invention today. And also the grand scale, the scale of a whole city as a kind of exhibition, may seem a paradoxical thing to speak of in this context of sort of curating. I use this example because it may be one of the kind of most glaring, recent examples for me of something that can be really done, which is light in a budget, and at the same time, necessary in terms of its structural support, but has a large effect. And as a result, somehow, one can say that the Tirana project reimagined the way a biennial or an exhibition can happen. So moreover, it somehow hopefully tried to sort of manage to step outside of the museum context and be literally in the streets, available to all kinds of spectators, actively taking a role in social conditions and political life, and in constant dialogue with time, weather, entropy, and chance. Some of those things, the museum very often excludes. So, by now you probably, wonder eventually what has all of this to do with, the work within a museum, which is my main activity, to work in the Museum of Modern Art of the city of Paris. So when I don't organize coffee breaks or, biennales or infinite conversations, I, have an office at the museum and organize their museum shows. And sort of my somehow relationship to museum has been from the very beginning kind of always oscillating between, inside and outside the museum. The director of the museum, Suzanne Paget, has asked me in the early 90s to curate a program which is called Migrateurs, which is basically each artist invited to do a small, sometimes almost imperceptible intervention into the institution, which can have unexpected effects on the audience, and which isn't kind of always a typical contemporary art audience. So this idea of crossing audience was there from the beginning, and the idea that, an artist could do a project in the cafeteria, an artist could do a project on the roof, an artist could use the telephone system. Douglas Gordon inserted a virus in the telephone system of the museum, or could reinstall the collection. So a bit this idea of Robert Musil, who once said, if there is art, it's very often where we expect it least. Also undermining of expectation was very much the program of this Migrateurs. And it also being allowed within a big museum, so it allowed obviously to show very young artists before they would be ready to do a big museum shows.